My name is Mariano Nunes. Actually, my full name is probably you've seen it in the brochure is much longer, but I decided to keep it simple and just make it Nunes. I have the difficult challenge of keeping you awake after lunch, so I'm going to do my best. But if you feel like taking a nap, that's also okay with me. What we're going to be talking this hour is about cyber attacks and SAP systems. We're going to be discussing on and hopefully trying to draw some conclusions on whether our business critical infrastructure is exposed or not, right? So I hope we can all together do an analysis on that. First of all, I would like to thank the Black Hat team. Today is actually the 5th year since my first talk. Actually, my first talk on SAP was in Black Hat 2007. So I want to thank all of them for the support. Let me introduce a little bit of who's Synopsys and about myself very quickly. On Synopsys, what we do is we are highly focused on the security of ERP systems and business critical infrastructure. So you may have heard or read some of our publications on SAP, but we're also starting to cover other platforms like Oracle ERP systems. You may have seen like a couple of weeks ago, we released over 8 advisories on J.D. Edwards that were highly critical, and we're also working on the other platforms. We mainly work with global Fortune 100 companies or 1,000 companies in the US and Europe. And what we do is we provide ERP security software, like on Synopsys X1 is a software that automates the security assessments of SAP platforms or ERP platforms. And we have some other open source projects that I invite you to go to our website and play with. We provide ERP security consultancy services like SAP penetration testing, SAP security assessment, and we also do trainings like the ones that we usually do in conferences such as Black Hat. About myself, I'm the co-founder and CEO at Synopsys. I come from the very technical background, so I've been working a lot doing vulnerability research and penetration testing, and I have discovered some vulnerabilities, mainly in SAP, but also in other platforms. Well, I've been speaking in some conferences about this subject. I developed the first open source, actually that was I presented in Black Hat 2007, it was called Sapito, the first open source SAP penetration testing framework. And now we forked that into Bizploit, that is the first ERP penetration testing framework, open source as well, right? Well, and I have also some publications and things that you are more than welcome to get on our website. So that's it for the introduction. This is what we are going to be talking on today. We're going to make a very quick introduction to the SAP world and what actually SAP is, if anyone here is not very familiar with the concept. Then we're going to be talking about why we think there was a dangerous status quo in regarding the security of these systems. We're going to talk about external and internal threats that may be affecting them. We're going to talk about our experiences after doing several SAP security assessments. We're going to see which is the real world status of the security of these implementations. We're going also to leave you with the top 10 vulnerabilities that are affecting the SAP technical infrastructure layer, so you can maybe go back home and check for them. And we're going to finally talk about how we can possibly defend the platform from internal and external attackers. So I'd like to first check how many of you have SAP in your company or work for a company with SAP? Okay, pretty much. Okay, awesome. For the ones that have never heard about SAP in the life before, SAP is basically the largest provider of business management solutions in the world. So it has more than 140,000 implementations, more than 90,000 customers in the world. So it's really widely deployed, and it's running most of the most important business information in the world. Right? It's used by the largest companies, either private or I mean commercial companies, governmental organizations, and defense agencies to run their everyday business critical processes. So we're talking about things like invoicing, procurement, production, sales, logistics, handling the payroll, all these processes where SAP, or usually where SAP is deployed, all of this process and this information is managed by these systems. So that's why we say it's a business critical infrastructure. I mean, this is something obviously that attackers know. Attackers know that these systems are keeping the most important information. And if they go after an SAP system, it's probably not going to be just for fun. It's not probably going to be a script kiddie. They may be trying to engage in espionage attacks, yes, just maybe stealing sensitive customers, vendors, or human resources information, financial planning, getting financial results before the closing of the quarter, for instance, checking on profits. If companies with high regards regarding intellectual property, that's also a good target for attackers. The attacker may try to just take the systems offline, right? You can imagine, I mean, these companies running SAP systems have thousands of employees whose everyday job is just to sit on the desk and maybe work with SAP system transactions, creating vendors, creating invoices, whatever. So if an attacker takes off the SAP system, that would also mean a lot of losses for the company. And finally, it's more a high-profile attack, but an attacker can engage into financial frauds, modifying financial information, creating ghost vendors, modifying vendor bank account numbers, for instance. We talked in Black Hat 2010, I think, on the possibility of someone installing a backdoor in an SAP system and, for instance, changing the bank account numbers of where the payments were going. And that's totally possible if the system is not properly protected. So that's why we say the SAP systems are the business crown jewels. Some presentations we did last year. But if you really still don't believe that this is critical, I tell you that SAP, as my friend Andreas said, is critical for our lives, because over 70% of the world's beer and chocolate is handled by companies running SAP systems. So I hardly doubt that we can live with SAP systems for a while. So let's get into why we think there was a strange status quo some time ago. And I think the problem comes mainly on what SAP security actually means. So 5 years ago, when we first did the presentation here in Black Hat, SAP security was practically a synonym of segregation of duties control. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this concept, but it basically means that to have the responsibilities across a business process split among different individuals so that no one can control the full process and perform a fraud, right? The idea is to make it more difficult for fraudsters. So for instance, make sure that if there is a user in the system who can create vendors, that he cannot create purchase orders. Otherwise, he can be paying to his friend Jim, or John, not Tim. In fact, I mean, how this is translated to a technical landscape, all these like incompatible functions are translated, are poured into a matrix, a segregation of duties matrix, and this is translated to SAP transaction and authorization objects. So basically what SAP security was making sure that the users that I have in the system, none of them have these dangerous authorizations at the same time, right? So what we faced was that most organizations actually had SAP security in place. So they were spending huge amount of money into having a dedicated team of SAP security professionals that were basically all day long checking for user roles and profiles and making sure that they were properly set, that it's a very difficult and challenging job per se. Also having segregation of duties on GRC software that is also usually highly costly, and I think these numbers could be much, much higher in large organizations. So we realized that the information security community and the big four auditing companies, every auditing firm was fine with that status quo. They had the tools to check for segregation of duties violations. The SAP security people had the skill set, so everyone was happy with that. Until, well, we came out. And also all the information, I mean, if you check for SAP security online, all was related to segregation of duties and to user roles and authorizations. The thing is that one day I was back in 2005. I was working in a different company, and I was mostly doing pen testing, web app pen testing, and research. And we were hired to do a web pen test. The only difference was that back then, I mean, in this customer, the web app was running on an SAP application server. When they told me that and told me you have to test this, it's running on an SAP system, I didn't know what SAP actually meant, and I never touched one SAP system before in my life. And suddenly, well, I went over there with a friend, and we started pen testing the application. But instead of finding issues in the custom code of the customer, we started discovering issues on the framework itself, right? So we went online. Back then, well, still on, but back then it was much better. We went on security focus and said, okay, let's see if this is reported. Probably we are stumbling upon something that someone already did, but they were not, right? So I got to my manager and told him, hey, look, this is SAP. SAP is being used in the largest companies in the world. And for some reason that I don't understand, no one is really taking a look into this kind of threats. So I kind of convinced him to let us some time to play with the system at the customers, because also that's what it's one of the biggest challenges on how to get the software to play with in the first place, at least back then. And then I did a specific research into what's called RFC interface that I presented on Black Hat 2007. Basically showing that an attacker could take over an SAP system by default, even without having a user in the system. And back then, the total number, and I hope you keep this number in the back of your mind through the presentation, the number of SAP security nodes that were released was 90, yes, in all history. So that was what SAP security was, and this is at least what I think SAP security really is. I think SAP security is a very complex discipline that must be addressed holistically, yes, pretty much as everything else. If you address it partially, then something is missing. So please take me right on this. Segregation of duties controls are absolutely necessary and are really important, but the thing is that it's just not enough. Because if you think about an SAP system like here, I mean, in this graphic that we have here, where you have an operating system, a database, what we call the business runtime or business infrastructure layer, and the business logic, segregation of duties controls are only taking care of security in this layer. So what we discovered was that basically no one or very few companies were taking proper care of the business infrastructure. And this is a very critical piece of software. It manages things like authenticating user, authorizing user activities, encrypting, interfacing with other systems, auditing what's going on in the system. And just as any other software, it can be prone to security vulnerabilities that, if they are exploited, will lead to severe attacks to the business information. So it doesn't matter really how strong the system was from a segregation of duties perspective. If someone hits the business infrastructure layer, it would be game over for the system. And I want to stop here for a second to think about the risk profile that we're talking about. So let's think about segregation of duties weakness. In order to exploit that, the attacker first of all needs to have a valid user account in the system. So it has to be someone who has already some degree of trust by you, because you have granted him a user on the system. Then he needs to find out that he has more access than he should have. So maybe he was allowed to create vendors, and then he moved into other positions in the company. No one ever took his privileges away from him, and now he can also make payments, so he can commit a fraud. And also what's really important is that common auditing features, if they're enabled, they may assist the company in detecting his activities. On the other hand, an exploitation of a technical infrastructure weakness, the attacker in this case doesn't even need a user account in the system. So this obviously makes the universe of possible attackers much bigger. And what's important is that most of the attacks on this layer will allow him to achieve SAP all. What SAP all is like the highest privileges on the SAP system, so you can basically do anything. It will mean a full compromise of the system, with the added problem that common auditing features would not serve to detect his activities, right? So the risk profile is much higher. And also, I want to think about how this has been evolving over time. So this is a chart that shows the evolution of the SAP security nodes released over year after year. So we were talking that in 2007, they were less than 50 vulnerabilities released per year. And just in 2010, SAP released over 835, I think, if I'm not wrong, security nodes, right? So obviously, based on my calculations that maybe we're missing someone, but and I'm not taking care of taking into account the 2012 vulnerabilities. They're about 140, I think. But obviously, if we compare with the 90 issues that were back in the end of 2006, there have been quite an increase over the last years. Okay. Yeah, just a minor note about this is that this is the result of a lot of different factors, like more research in the community, more pressure for customers, and also a lot of in-case or increased efforts from SAP to clean up a lot of bugs and be more proactive in releasing security nodes. But this obviously, I mean, customers are now facing a new challenge that is, how to manage all these nodes that are released every month. So let's talk about external and internal threats. Usually, well, not usually, in some cases we talk with companies and they told us, okay, I really don't care about the SAP security because my SAP system is only accessible internally, right? I don't have any external components. And while it's obviously can be true in many companies, it's not very uncommon to find SAP systems online nowadays. Nowadays, companies have to get connected with vendors, with employees. You have all these mobile devices that are hitting back to an online SAP system. And it's really not very difficult for attackers to find SAP systems online. So how many of you are familiar with Shodan? No Shodan? Okay, quite a few. So if you go to Shodan and search for SAP, just a simple query, you'll get more than, well, I checked it today as well. This is growing quite fastly. This is, I think, it's for last week. And today it was at 2,700 something already. So those are more than 2,000 systems that are connected, SAP web application servers that are connected online. You can also check, last year we have been doing a lot of presentations on attacks to SAP web applications. We're not going to go into detail of that today, but in that presentations you can check which kind of risks there are regarding SAP web applications if they are misconfigured. And also attackers can use Google, just some Google Docs, Google hacking to search for common folders or common directories that are explicitly used by SAP systems. But when after doing this last year, we were eager to know a bit more. I mean, is it just web applications that SAP that are commonly exposed, or there are also more services that are exposed to the internet? And even if companies believe that they are not online, I have to say that most of them are probably wrong. This is because when you acquire SAP software license, SAP by contract tells you that you have to have the possibility of them connecting remotely to your company, to your SAP systems, in order to provide support and in order to provide, in order to audit how you're using basically licenses. And this is done through a component that's called SAP router. Okay, so the good way to deploy the SAP router is by through a VPN to SAP specific servers. But anyway, you are still already online. I mean, it's not more a closed system. There is already one interface to the external world. And then the second question that arises is whether services like the dispatcher, gateway, management console, message server, this kind of internal services that may be used in an internal network are exposed also to the internet. So so we tried to see actually which was the reality on that. This is still work in progress. For this, we got the great help of a research group. It's called Mateslab, who's basically analyzing one of the projects that they have. It's a distributed Nmap scanners that I strongly suggest you to check with them. And basically, they are checking if there are SAP or ERP systems online. So if we search in Shodan in the Netherlands, we'll see that there are about 45 results of SAP web servers just in the Netherlands. And based on Mateslab initial results, there are presumably at least 16 systems exposing the SAP router to the internet, directly connected to the internet. We also did a presentation on SAP router about 3 years ago. And basically, if the SAP router is not properly protected, it would allow anyone to access the SAP systems or maybe other systems on the internal network. So it's very critical to deploy the right, and in the first place should never be connected to the internet. So this is just a brief on what we or these guys actually are doing, and we hope to have some results on actually a full scan on the internet to see how many ERP systems are really exposed and how our business critical infrastructure is looking from that point of view. Not only SAP, but also the other ERP systems. So we hope to have more results in the near time. So, sorry. So now I want to get into some of our experiences or war stories, or actually, I mean, because this is just all theory, and we're talking about things that can happen or cannot happen, but let's look at a little bit on our experience. So since 2005, actually, we started doing the first SAP penetration tests. As from that date to today, we have analyzed over 500 SAP application servers from different systems, from different companies. Companies from Europe, US, Latin America, Asia, Australia, I mean, different, a wide variety of systems and companies. And this is where I want to stress, which is the whole point of this. In all the cases, this is the constraints or the methodology under which we were working. We will only provide network access regular access to the company's end user network. So we are not placed on a specific SAP DMZ or critical server DMZ. We are just another regular user that was plugged into the network. In many cases, actually most cases, we also do this through VPNs. So it was a VPN to the regular end user network. What we were given was just a list of IP addresses of the SAP application servers. This was actually to speed up the process. We could just launch a scan and detect them, but the only information we had was a list of IP addresses, and no user and password credentials were provided. So what have we learned in these assessments? We have learned that over 95% of the systems that we evaluated were exposed to espionage, sabotage, and fraud attacks. So anyone connected to the local network and just being able to connect to the SAP system without a user and password could end up taking over the entire business information on the system. Then we also find out that only 5% of actually it's a bit less, of the evaluated SAP systems had proper security audit logging in place. This is quite interesting as well. You remember the number of security nodes and the number of patches that were going out. Well, we have not found still a single case where the customer was completely up to date and fully updated on the latest SAP security patches. And I think this is one of the worst problems, is that in many cases, I mean, we were not using 0 days, or we were not using internal exploits that we had. We were just using what's publicly available, right? So the vulnerabilities that actually I released or I discussed about in 2007 in Black Hat, we are actually still using many of them and discovering many of them in SAP systems, and they're just they're still there, right? So I think this also raises up some questions on what are we doing with the information that we get in this kind of conferences. So now I'm going to talk to you about which were the most of the top 11 vulnerabilities that we usually find across this kind of assessments. And for that, I would like, first of all, to introduce you to BSEC. BSEC is a non-profit organization. The best simple way to put it is like an OWASP for ERP systems, right? And it's basically, an organization that focuses on threats affecting ERP systems. So we have created a list that is called the BSEC Tech 11 that it specifically talks about the threats to the technical or infrastructure layers on SAP systems. If you go right now to the website, you'll find two things. The first one that is totally ugly, and we're working on that. And the second one is that the list is outdated. So this is like an exclusive preview of what the new version of the BSEC Tech 11 will look like. So you're also more than welcome to join and contribute. I told you this is like non-profit and an open organization. There are like five members, I think, right now. So in the original presentation that I was planning to do, I was going into a lot of detail into each of them, but I recall that it was going to be after lunch, and you will be probably throwing things at me. So I'm just going to go into some of them, right? But you can definitely check on the white paper to see the details and the business impact of each of them. So vulnerable software in use, this is very easy to understand. It's basically companies, if you're missing a SAP security patch, you're probably on risk of getting exploited. Standard users with default passwords. This may sound silly, trivial, whatever, but every time we do an SAP security assessment, we still find systems with standard users with default passwords that have been known for several years. And for an attacker, it's as difficult as just typing that in. The users are highly privileged, so it can mean a complete compromise because of a user that was left by default. Unsecure SAP gateways. The gateway is a component that is used to connect with other systems. This is what we basically talked about in 2007. The main risk here is that the gateway does not authenticate certain kind of interfaces, so you can just basically tell the gateway to start a program on the SAP system, like an arbitrary program. So that's like kind of a remote command execution issue. Unsecure SAP Oracle authentication. This one is really interesting. I discovered this in, I think, 2005 or 6. But then I discovered that someone else had discovered that in 2002, and it was public since 2002. And it basically means that Oracle has a feature called remote OS authentication. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. It basically, the database says that, okay, I trust that this connection has already been authenticated by the operating system. So I know who invented that in Oracle, but he's probably not working there anymore because Oracle there is a guide from Oracle that says, please do not ever enable this parameter or this kind of authentication. The problem is that there is an SAP guide that tells you, well, now there is a new version that is a workaround on this, but was just released a few months ago. But till now, SAP demanded that you use that parameter to true. So basically, the attack here is that, and the impact is that anyone, if you have SAP running with Oracle, anyone who can connect to the Oracle database, to the Oracle listener, can take over the database entirely and access all the business information in the database, access or modify, right? So that's a very critical one that was public in like Security Focus 2002, and we still find it every time. Insecure RFC interfaces. This is also an interesting one. Many cases we see that maybe the production system, in SAP you have like development, quality assurance, and production, like to simplify. Many times the production system is kind of more okay from the security point of view because it's the one that auditors look at. But the attacker can break into development and use one of these proprietary interfaces to production and take over the production system. So it's very important to look into these kind of connections between your systems. Login, security audit login. I told you we didn't find it almost anywhere, properly said. message server, another SAP specific component that will allow an attacker to perform some kind of man-in-the-middle attacks and end up compromising the system. Dangerous SAP web applications. You can check the presentations that we have done last year. I'm not going to bore you with that. This is interesting. SAP has a lot of administration interfaces that are not authenticated. So if the attacker has network access to the service, he can perform dangerous things like shutting down the system or crazy things like that one. This also was quite surprising. We found many customers who did not have internal DMZs for the SAP systems. They didn't have an IPS or an IDS or even a firewall to start with. So the network environment is obviously highly important. And encryption, a couple of years ago, a Russian researcher called Denis Yurevich showed how it was possible to uncompress the traffic between the client and the SAP server, the SAP weak traffic. So it has made it much more important to encrypt the traffic nowadays. So well, that was it. It was the fastest I could go through this list. What I want to do is now I'm going to show you a little demo on the one that we presented on 2007 for you to understand what we are talking about. How are we doing with time? Okay. So let me switch over to Bizploit. Okay, so as I told you, Bizploit is an open source software that you can get on our website and play with. So what I'm going to be doing right now is to assess an SAP system that I'm running on my laptop on another VMware. So I'm using Bizploit for that. We're going to set the target host. And we're going to, basically Bizploit works through connectors. That's basically mapping each SAP port. So this is going to be doing a port scan and detect all the SAP services that are available on the target system and configure Bizploit for it to be able to audit the system. So now we can start going to the modules, plugins. So we're going to be using discovery, find reg servers, and a vulnerability assessment. I'm going to tell you right now what this is. Okay, so I'm going to be basically finding or looking for a specific of this vulnerability in the gateway, whether there is a external server registered to the gateway that will allow us to, or will allow an attacker to do something, as you will see. So we hit on start, and what has happened? Okay, so Bizploit started running the discovery plugins. It found that he could reach an RFC server through the gateway. So he creates a new target, and basically then it runs the vulnerability assessment modules, and it says that, okay, this is a vulnerability, this is probably something that is not right. So if we go to vulnerabilities and show, we see that there is a vulnerability with ID 0 that can be exploited by these two modules, right? So let's use the first one. We go to exploit module, section, sorry, fcexec. This exploit in particular is going to be creating a shell, like Metasploit-like shells. So shells start 0. And what you have here is basically a command shell over the remote SAP system. Okay, so it's that difficult how we can get to exploit an SAP gateway. Actually, there is even a more simplified version that is not using registered but started servers. But at this stage, I mean, the privileges of the attacker are the seed ADM user or subsystem ID ADM user. Sorry, maybe you don't see that on the back. So, I mean, at least in my case, I was very used to doing like general network pen testing or web app pen testing. So I always strive to get to root or to get like a command shell, and that was, I mean, when you get happy, right? In the ERP world, I mean, this is really nothing. If you talk about to a manager and tell him that you are able to get a command shell on an SAP system, he will probably don't get it. So if you want to communicate in a different way, what you can do is to use the other module, in this case, the OR escalation. In this case, this is an SAP running with Oracle. So we'll run that module. And basically, what the module is exploiting here is that this lack of, or this trust in the authentication with the database. So the user that is being run, the operating system commands, can connect to the database without having to provide credentials, because the database trusts that he was already authenticated. So the attacker can do, something like this. And he can basically get all the users in the SAP system with the passwords. I mean, he can just do an update and change one hash and log in with that user. He can do all that. But he can also, I'm not going to be able to show it here, but I mean, this is as difficult and as it can get for an attacker to get, for instance, all the credit card transactions that are stored in the system, or to get all the information from the employees, or all the salaries of the employees. And he can also update on that table, right? So he can probably give someone a good raise, a good holidays. This is as it can get if the system is not properly protected. Okay. So finally, let's think for a while how we can defend the SAP platform. And I think that here we have some challenges. Companies face some challenges. The first one is knowledge. SAP has a wide variety of components, like you have ABAP, SAP systems, Java, SAP systems, you have different versions, you have business objects. I mean, every component has a very particular security architecture and security concepts that it's important that you have people in your company that really knows that very well. The second one is scope. Yes, it may be easy to secure or to lock down one SAP application server, but I know we have customers with 100 of SAP servers or 1,000 SAP servers. So if you want to do that right, you need to secure every landscape. So like the ERP, the CRM, the SCM, all the landscapes. In every landscape, you don't need to, I mean, you need not to secure only production. You need to secure development, QA, sandbox, pre-production, production. Each of these systems have clients or mandants. You need to lock all them down, sorry. And you need to also lock down every application server, not just the central instance. And in turn, every application server has like more than 1,500 parameters. So you need to know which of those parameters you need to lock down. So this definitely is a big challenge. And the final one, I think is periodicity. It's like we many times find that companies are maybe doing 1 or 2 audits a year, and it's a challenge, but the systems must be evaluated periodically. So at least after, well, SAP did quite a good move in 2010, that they started releasing security patches periodically, the second Tuesday of every month, as Microsoft, for instance. So it's important to check after that date if your SAP system, if there are nodes that are affecting your SAP system, and maybe prioritize at least which one you're going to be implementing, but to do this periodically. And the final points that I want to make regarding the challenge is who is actually responsible for the SAP security. Because this is something that we also find interesting in many cases. Unlike maybe other systems like web servers, domain controllers, LDAP directories, this kind of stuff, the security of SAP systems usually falls under like a gray zone that's called the business, right? And this usually means, I mean, that the people that is in charge of securing the systems is the same one that is responsible for verifying whether the systems are properly secure or not, right? So you know that this usually fails, right? It doesn't work very well. So I think that it's okay that the business or the SAP teams or the CIO of the company are responsible of protecting and configuring the systems, all right? But I think it's the responsibility of the information security manager, the CISO department, the information security officers to verify that they're actually doing their job all right. I think otherwise there is a segregation of duties problem in that. So these are just a few questions that can keep you thinking about how this is today in your organization. I mean, is the SAP platform a black box for your team? I'm assuming that most of us here are from the information security department, right? Are you not allowed to look at it? And why? Why is that? You can test everything else, but the SAP system not. So you're trusting your SAP security people, and that's all right. But do you verify that they're actually doing it right? And I think the third one is actually the biggest issue. I think the key question is who will be ultimately responsible if there is a security breach to a system of a vulnerability release in full disclosure, right? Because the SAP security guys are not looking at full disclosure. So who's going to be responsible if there is a security breach in the platform that way? So finally, some conclusions before I leave you some time for questions or to wake up from the sleep. Conclusion, I think that we've been saying this for a while. Segregation of duties controls are necessary, but are not enough. The infrastructure layer of SAP system is really critical, and it just as any other software in the world can, it's made by humans, it can have problems, security issues, and if they're exploited, this would be a big impact for the business. The main problem with the attacks to this layer is that the attacker does not even require a user and password, so the threat profile is much higher. You've seen how the number of SAP security nodes has been evolving. The main problem is that customers are not really catching up with that. And this is also something interesting. Many times we hear like, yeah, anyway, our SAP system has not been hacked. But I told you that less than 5% of companies have security auditing in place. So actually, how can you possibly tell if you don't even have the basic auditing features enabled? That's something to think about. SAP systems are really connected to the internet. I hope that these guys from Matthew's lab keep on doing the great job into finding out how many they are and how they're exposed. SAP, really I've been working with SAP since 5 years already, and I can tell that they have been really putting a lot of effort into increasing the security of the customer systems with new guidelines, with the security patch days, new standards. It's important now that customers try to follow on that, but it's definitely a challenge. So again, while the business may work on the security of the systems, and it's okay, someone needs to verify that they're doing the job right, and I think that falls on us. And yeah, if we see that our business critical infrastructure is hacked by exploiting a 5-year-old, 8 or 9-year-old vulnerability, then I think that we are probably doing something that's not very wrong, not very well. So that was what I had to say. I hope that I think that most of you survive. Everything has the eyes open. So I'm completely open to any questions that you may have.
Would you say you are secure if you follow the SAP guidelines?
Yeah.
Is that a sufficient level, or?
The question was if I think that you are secure if you follow the SAP security guidelines. Yeah, I think that at least you are in a much better place than most of the companies, because most of the companies are actually, when I started doing the assessments, for instance, this Oracle vulnerability that I talked to you about, this is documented in an SAP security guide since 2005 or 6, I think. And if you really want to secure the system, you just read the guide, and there it tells you how to do it. So I definitely suggest going on the SAP security guidelines. The latest one, they just released a new one on January. The latest one are more focused also in this business infrastructure layer. So it's a good way at least to know which are the things that you need to look for. Yeah.
Are the problems you addressed here also addressed to the SAP company, and are they aware of these problems, and do they do something to avoid such problems in the future or update, inform their customers and so like that?
Yeah.
Publish better security notes or security guidelines?
Yeah, I think everyone heard, but the question is basically is SAP doing something about this, right? Yeah, I to be honest, I mean, I started working or talking with them in 2007 when we started reporting the first vulnerabilities. Seeing the transition that they did from that point to today, I think that they're getting much better. Maybe I think it's in a sense how Microsoft used to be some time ago, and then you saw all that transition and how things got much better. I think that SAP is following that path and is definitely getting better. The thing is it's really a problem that they have many versions, it's like much more complex than many organizations, right? So actually downporting all the patches, testing everything before there is released to customers, I know that it's definitely not easy. But yeah, I think that they're moving in the right direction. I think that there's still road to go, but I think that customers are also more aware and also making SAP be better each day, because it's also a customer asking for it now. It's not just a crazy researcher somewhere, right? So yeah, I think that they're in the right road, but there's still some road ahead. If you, sorry? If I can explain, yeah. Well, it's a commercial software. Basically, it's a software that you install in your organization, and it connects to all your SAP environments and scans either in black box or in white box mode. It scans if you have any vulnerability affecting your system, and it tells you which is a risk and how to fix it. That's it. Then, if you want, we can talk about it, but not to make so much sales speech. Okay.
So you said that only 5% of customers have security audit logging enabled, and you've also shown an exploit that didn't appear to go through any of the user UI or the functions backing the user UI at all, but instead span up a shell on one of the app servers and then issued commands directly to the database. My question is, if the customer had the security audit log enabled, would they have seen any of that?
Oh, and the question is, I showed before that only 5% of customers have security audit in place, and I just show an attack that was more in the lower layers, database, or operating system access, whether these auditing features would enable to detect that. The 5% that I talk about is just having the basic auditing features. So these auditing features won't detect that attacks at all. For instance, in order to detect that attack, you will need to enable the gateway login. So then you'll see the first compromise, the execution of operating system commands. You may see that, but you have to enable that and review it, right? It's also, but this is not enabled by default. So most companies cannot tell whether someone is really exploiting this on the system.
Is there any resource where you can have an overview about which solutions for monitoring and scanning maybe the configurations of SAP systems is?
Yeah.
Like for companies which have not the resources to have own specialists, but which would like to have a rough overview and perform some monitoring to detect if there is something.
Sure. Yeah, the question is if there are any monitoring solutions that could help companies to automate this review and perform this continuously. Well, the first one that I had to tell about is X1. That is a software that we have that is in use by large companies in US and Europe. SAP has its own solutions also in the solution manager that may help you in some way. And there are a couple of more solutions that could be used, but yeah, they're not. It's not such big. The important thing is that if you run any of this regular security software, like security scanners against your SAP platform, it's not going to detect any of these issues. It's going to find things on the operating system database, but not on this layer. Any other questions? Sorry, I thought that, yeah. Well, there is one in the back. Then we'll see. I would say that, well, the question is this 95% that we say that we were able to compromise, on attacker would be able to compromise, how's the split between web technologies and traditional? That's more or less the question. I would say that, I mean, most of the assessment that we have done were done from the internal network, right? So we have done a few that are from the outside, for the web application, and yeah, but I would say that they are like maybe 10% of the assessment that we did. So anyway, in the cases where we were internally, we could also access the web interface of the system that's enabled by default. So it's more or less the same for, I mean, there are exploits or vulnerabilities that affect the web components, such as exploits that affect the gateway. And many of them are enabled by default, so it's basically, the attacker can choose which way to go. We usually go through the gateway issue, for instance. It's like a silver bullet right now. But you can find it in all the layers, like inside SAP. Yeah, the Bisploit, what I just showed, is basically a fork of Sapito that we are also extending to other ERP platforms. Sapito was just based on SAP, but if you look at the code, the source code is basically the same. It's a GPL, as it's GPL, we fork it. And now we're planning also to incorporate some JD Edwards modules as well. So yeah, but it's, if you ever play with Sapito, it's going to be the same. Oh, a bit improved as well. Yeah, we go back to.
So you mentioned that once upon a time the communication between SAP application servers was unencrypted and and in encryption. And I was wondering if you can give us a quick overview of how they did it, because establishing trust between a large collection of servers and enterprises is harder than one might expect.
Yeah, sure. The important thing here, well, the discussion is about encryption and how that's implemented in SAP words. The first thing to note is that what I mentioned here about encryption, the key point, or at least the first point, is on the client to server, right? On how, because clients are sending passwords and sensitive information to the server. That was traditionally not encrypted. I think it was last year when SAP basically bought the products of a company called Secude, that was the most known or well-known company that provided security encryption software for SAP. So now SAP is releasing this encryption software as part of the standard for free. So that's something good from SAP. How it's done? It's basically a PKI encryption mode. So you have to install certificates. If it's server to server, you have to install certificates, exchange them, and typically like a regular PKI implementation. The algorithm, the encryption algorithm that is used depends on the library that you're specifically using. Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Are there any well-known cases where companies were hacked and their SAP systems were hacked?
Yeah, question is whether there's known cases of SAP, of companies being hacked or by SAP, by the SAP systems. Yeah, I have to say that yes, it's not well known or public. I mean, after talking with or being in trainings and talking to customers, you start to hear that things happen, but they don't hit the headlines. They never go public yet. Okay. Well, if there are any questions anyway, I'm going to be here for the rest of the conference for sure, or the rest of the day. You can also write me an email or anything that you want. So thank you very much for your time.